So picture this. It's 1909.
Okay.
And there's this young man sleeping in men's hostels in Vienna. He's literally just surviving by, selling these cheap painted postcards to tourists in the shadows of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
All right. Totally obscure.
Exactly. But then, just over 2 decades later, that exact same man legally convinced a modern democratic republic to just vote away its own existence. And today, we're looking at the blueprint of how that transition actually happens.
Yeah, we are diving into excerpts from The Architect of Ruin, The Rise and Fall of Hitler. And, well, what makes this text so critical to examine isn't just the historical timeline. It's the mechanics of it. I mean, it treats the collapse of the Weimar Republic not as this inevitable tragedy, but as a deliberate structural dismantling.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you treat Adolf Hitler as just this static monster who, materialized out of the ether, you miss the entire point.
You really do.
Monsters don't just appear. They are built, and more importantly, they're invited in through the front door of a vulnerable society. So today is really about understanding the architecture of that invitation.
Definitely. And the source text starts by dissecting his formative years, focusing specifically on this massive failure that really becomes the psychological anchor for everything that follows.
Because he didn't start out with political ambitions.
No, not at all. He had a singular obsession with becoming a classical artist. So he applies to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and gets rejected twice.
Twice?
Wow. And the administration gives him brutal feedback. They specifically cite a total, quote, unfitness for painting.
I mean, that is a profound blow to the ego. And then after his mother passes away, which really strips his only real emotional support, he spends 5 years in utter poverty.
Right.
And this is where the text highlights a really critical psychological pivot. When faced with crushing personal failure, the healthy response is introspection. You look at your technique, you adapt, or you change career paths.
Yeah, you adjust.
But he chooses the exact opposite mechanism, which is psychological projection.
He completely refuses to accept that his lack of skill is the issue. Instead, the resentment it metastasizes.
Like a virus.
Exactly. He begins constructing this narrative where his failure is actually the result of this vast, shadowy conspiracy. The text points out that he starts blaming intellectuals and minorities and outsiders.
So it's never his fault.
Never. He essentially builds a mental architecture where he is the perpetual victim of a corrupt system rather than, an artist who just simply wasn't good enough.
It's like doing a financial audit of a failing company.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Like instead of looking at the terrible balance sheet and realizing the product is bad, the CEO convinces himself that corporate espionage is the only reason they are losing money.
Yeah, it completely protects the ego.
Exactly. But it requires a constant enemy to sustain the delusion. However, a bitter guy selling postcards with a victim complex doesn't just, overthrow a government. That toxic ideology requires a vehicle.
And that vehicle arrives with the outbreak of the First World War. He enlists in the German army, and the military structure provides the exact framework his life was missing.
Structure and purpose.
Exactly. He has a uniform, daily orders, and for the first time, he has a sense of belonging to a collective, elevated purpose.
But then 1918 happens. Germany surrenders.
Right.
And for him, the collapse of the war effort isn't just a geopolitical defeat. It is the sudden theft of his identity.
Yeah.
He is thrust right back into the void. But now
he has military training.
Yes, military training and this deep-seated fury over what he perceives as a betrayal from within.
And the broader society he returns to is equally fractured.
Yeah.
Post-war Germany under the Weimar Republic is just reeling.
Yeah.
The Treaty of Versailles doesn't just defeat the nation, it imposes catastrophic financial reparations and territorial losses that are basically designed to humiliate them.
Right.
And the text emphasizes that this national humiliation created a fertile ground for radicalization.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the source illustrates that vulnerability with the 1923 hyperinflation crisis. And the sheer mathematics of it are just staggering.
Oh, it's almost hard to comprehend.
It is. A single loaf of bread costing 200 billion marks. People taking literal wheelbarrows of cash to the bakery only to find the price doubled by the time they got to the front of the line.
Yeah.
I mean, the social contract completely evaporates when your life savings can't even buy a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
But how did he specifically capitalize on that exact panic?
Well, when an economic system fundamentally breaks down to that degree, the public's tolerance for traditional, measured political discourse just vanishes.
They don't want to debate.
No. They don't want a 10-point economic recovery plan. They are starving and they're terrified.
Yeah.
They want an immediate, tangible explanation for their suffering.
Which brings us to how he uniquely used this. He joins a fringe political group that eventually becomes the Nazi Party, and he discovers he has a highly specific talent for the microphone.
Yes, he really did.
But the text makes a crucial distinction about his rhetoric. He doesn't offer policy. He offers a target.
He weaponizes the public's fear by providing a scapegoat. The speeches are purely emotional, highly aggressive, and entirely devoid of nuance.
Just raw anger.
Exactly. He looks at a populace desperate for stability and promises to make Germany great go. Again, framing the entire national crisis as a deliberate plot by the exact same outsiders he blamed for his art school rejection.
And the text details the specific mechanism he used to cement this narrative, which is the big lie. And the psychology behind this strategy is just fascinating.
It's defyingly effective.
It really is. The premise is that if you tell a small lie, people will fact-check you. But if you construct a lie so massive, so audacious, and so entirely disconnected from reality, the average person's critical thinking just shorts out.
Right. They assume no one would have the sheer audacity to fabricate something of that magnitude, so there must be some truth to it.
Exactly.
But what's really fascinating here is that the big lie requires infrastructure to work. It needs total saturation to overwrite reality. And the text points to a piece of technology that was instrumental here, the people's receiver.
The radios, right?
Yes. This was a state-subsidized radio, produced cheaply enough that almost every German household could afford one.
But the catch is that the device was engineered with a limited frequency range. Like, it couldn't pick up foreign broadcasts or independent frequencies. It was a closed loop.
A completely dedicated delivery system for propaganda. By ensuring this device was in every living room, he effectively monopolized the informational environment.
So you can't escape it.
You can't. The repetition of the big lie becomes inescapable. You hear it at work, you hear it in the streets, and now you hear it inside your own home.
And this relentless closed-loop manipulation obviously yields results. Because by January 30 in 1933, the political establishment elevates him to the position of chancellor.
Right.
But source text outlines a stark reality here. Being chancellor in a fragile coalition government under President Hindenburg is essentially a containment strategy.
Yeah, the traditional politicians thought they could use his popularity while controlling his radical impulses.
Which is just, it's such a massive miscalculation.
A fatal miscalculation. Because less than a month into his chancellorship, the Reichstag, which is the German parliament building, burns down in an arson attack.
And the text's analysis of his response to the fire is just a masterclass in exploiting a crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
He doesn't wait for an investigation. He doesn't call for calm. He instantly points the finger at political opponents, specifically the communists, and frames the fire as the opening salvo of a violent national uprising.
What's fascinating here is the speed. The speed with which he translates public panic into legislative power.
It's breathtaking.
He leverages the fear of a communist revolution to pressure President Hindenburg into signing the emergency decree. And this isn't just a temporary security measure. The decree legally suspends the fundamental civil liberties enshrined in the Weimar Constitution.
In literally a matter of hours, the legal right to free expression, freedom of the press, and the right to privacy are completely nullified.
Gone.
The state can now intercept mail, listen to phone calls, and arrest political opponents without warrant or trial. And it's all done under this unassailable banner of national security.
And the public largely accepts this because they prioritize the illusion of safety over, abstract civil liberties.
Yeah.
But the emergency decree is just the foundational layer. The true architectural collapse of the Republic happens with the Enabling Act.
This is perhaps the most crucial mechanism in the entire blueprint. Because to pass the Enabling Act, which would essentially allow him to bypass Parliament entirely and rule by decree, he needs a 2/3 majority vote from the very Parliament he intends to neuter.
Right.
And he secures this not through a military coup, but through a highly orchestrated mix of bureaucratic manipulation and physical intimidation.
He stations his paramilitary forces, the SA, inside and around the voting chamber.
There's literal armed men in the aisles.
Exactly. Meanwhile, he uses the freshly minted emergency decree to ban the communist deputies from even entering the building, which physically alters the arithmetic of the vote.
Wow.
He then makes these temporary bad faith promises to the remaining centrist parties just to secure their support.
So the parliament effectively looks at the armed men in the aisles, listens to the false assurances, and votes to legally transfer its legislative authority to one man.
Yeah, democracy didn't die in the dark. It voted for its own execution.
That is chilling. But once he had the government under his thumb, what about his own people? Did anyone in his circle realize he was going too far?
Well, with the state apparatus secured, the text shifts to how he consolidates his own internal power structure. By the summer of 1934, he faces a significant dilemma.
Okay.
The SA, that paramilitary force that helped intimidate his way to power, has grown to millions of members under the leadership of his longtime ally, Ernst Röhm.
And the traditional German military, the Reichswehr, looks at this massive, radical street army and sees a direct threat to their institutional supremacy.
Definitely. Big business leaders are equally alarmed by the SA's unpredictable behavior. So he is sitting on a powder keg, caught between the institutional power he needs to govern and the radical loyalists who put him in office.
So how does he handle it?
He resolves this tension with surgical ruthlessness. On June 30th, 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, he deploys his newer, elite, and entirely loyal guard, the SS.
Oh, wow.
And they systematically assassinate Ernst Röhm and the senior leadership of the SA.
It is the ultimate hostile takeover. He purges his closest allies the moment they become a political liability.
Yeah.
The message to the German public and the institutional elites is unmistakable. Loyalty to the past means nothing, and there are absolutely no moral constraints on his use of violence.
And this purge eliminates the last remaining internal check on his authority. So when President Hindenburg dies shortly after, the final bureaucratic barrier dissolves.
He just takes it all.
Hitler simply merges the offices of president and chancellor, claiming the ultimate title, the Führer, known as safe.
But fear alone can't sustain a nation, right? Now, a regime built entirely on terror and purges is inherently unstable. To solidify total compliance, you have to engineer a scenario where the populace actually feels like their lives are improving.
You have to manufacture a golden age.
Exactly. You need a success story.
Yeah.
And to the international community in the mid-1930s, Germany appears to be experiencing an unprecedented economic renaissance.
The statistics broadcasted to the world are staggering. The massive unemployment crisis that plagued the Weimar Republic seems to just evaporate.
Right.
The regime embarks on massive public works projects, most notably the Autobahn system. And you see carefully choreographed spectacles, like the Nuremberg rallies, projecting this image of a unified, highly efficient, and revitalized society.
The text, however, dissects the accounting behind this so-called economic miracle. It's analogous to a corporation that is deeply underwater but manages to boost its stock price by fraudulently cooking the books.
That's exactly what it was.
Right. The unemployment numbers plummeting from 6 million to nearly zero wasn't the result of brilliant fiscal policy. It was statistical erasure.
Yeah.
The state simply mandated that women and Jewish citizens were no longer eligible for the workforce and then scrubbed them from the unemployment registers.
Furthermore, the massive public spending wasn't generating sustainable economic growth. The nation was being systematically retooled into a command-style war economy.
So it was all a front.
Absolutely. The infrastructure projects and the secret rearmament programs were financed through massive, hidden state deficits.
They're essentially maxing out national credit cards to build a war machine, banking on the fact that they will eventually plunder neighboring countries to pay off the debt.
Exactly.
The prosperity is a facade designed to maintain domestic complacency while the gears of conquest are assembled in the background.
And as the physical machinery of war is constructed, the regime simultaneously constructs the legal machinery of persecution. In 1935, they passed the Nuremberg Laws. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the critical legal phase of the Holocaust. It is the bureaucratic foundation required for mass violence.
And the source material is highly specific about how these laws function. They didn't start with physical extermination. They started with definition.
Yes, legal definition.
The laws legally redefined what it meant to be German. Jewish citizens were officially stripped of their citizenship and reclassified as subjects of the state. The laws forbade marriage and intimate relations between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans.
And the psychological conditioning achieved through this legislation is just profound.
Yeah.
By utilizing the sterile, legitimate framework of the legal system, the state normalizes hatred.
Yeah.
When a government officially categorizes a group of people as second-class subjects on paper, it systematically desensitizes the rest of the population. It creates a psychological distance that makes the majority comfortable looking the other way.
It's a deliberate gradient.
Yeah.
You don't ask a society to tolerate mass murder overnight.
No, you can't.
First, you change the legal definitions. You convince the public that these individuals are fundamentally other. And once the society accepts that legal demotion, the threshold for acceptable violence is permanently lowered.
With total domestic control established, an economy addicted to military spending, and the populace psychologically conditioned, the regime inherently must expand.
They have to.
The ideology is rooted in the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, the belief that the German state is an organic entity that must aggressively consume the territory of its neighbors just to survive.
The text outlines how the international community completely misreads this dynamic. In 1938, German forces annex Austria. Shortly after, they demand and take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia.
And the response from world leaders is a masterclass in cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, they implement the policy of appeasement.
Because appeasement is born from the trauma of the First World War, the leaders of Britain and France are desperate to avoid another continental slaughter. They analyze Hitler's territorial demands through the lens of rational statecraft, operating on the flawed assumption that he is a traditional politician with finite goals. They believe that if they just concede to these initial demands, his grievances will be resolved and the geopolitical order will stabilize.
But you cannot negotiate a mutually beneficial treaty with a doctrine that requires your subjugation.
You really can't.
Appeasement fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the regime. The concessions didn't satisfy the machine. They only confirmed to its architect that the democracies were too weak to fight back.
Yeah.
And that illusion shatters permanently on September 1st, 1939, when German armor crosses into Poland, igniting the Second World War.
And under the fog and chaos of a global conflict, the regime initiates the horrific culmination of its ideology. The source text addresses the final solution not as an unfortunate byproduct of war, but as the ultimate intended destination of the regime's legal and psychological conditioning.
The analysis here is chilling because of the sheer bureaucratic efficiency involved. This wasn't the spontaneous violence of a battlefield. It was the complete industrialization of mass murder.
The regime deployed the exact same logistical planning used for modern manufacturing to build a sprawling network of extermination camps. This apparatus of death resulted in the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. Alongside them, the state targeted and slaughtered millions of Romani people, individuals with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents.
It is the absolute terminus of the Big Lie and the Nuremberg laws.
It is.
So what does this all mean? When you look at the architecture of the regime laid bare in the text, you see a system that is inherently cannibalistic.
Yeah, that's a good word for it.
An economy built on endless debt and a society fueled by perpetual expansion and extermination cannot achieve equilibrium. It requires constant forward momentum, or it collapses under its own weight.
And the structural flaws become undeniable as the conflict drags on. The regime declares war on the United States while simultaneously opening a massive, unsustainable second front against the Soviet Union.
Which is just strategic suicide.
Totally. By 1945, the physical reality of the world crushes the ideological delusion. The Allied forces advance relentlessly from the west, and the Soviet army systematically dismantles the German military in the east, converging on Berlin.
The man who stood at the podium in Nuremberg, who utilized the people's receiver to project an aura of invincibility, ends his life deep underground.
Yeah.
On April 30, 1945, as artillery shells reduce the capital to rubble above him, Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his concrete bunker. The 1,000-year Reich he promised his followers lasted exactly 12 years.
And as the text concludes, it demands that we synthesize the mechanics of those 12 years. History demonstrates that the levers of state power are morally neutral. The exact same bureaucratic and communicative tools that can be used to coordinate public health or build infrastructure can be effortlessly inverted to dismantle civil rights and orchestrate genocide.
The narrative we've explored is not a testament to the dark genius of one individual. It is a highly specific, repeatable blueprint of systemic vulnerability.
Yeah, warning.
Yes, exactly. It shows us exactly how a modern state can be hijacked when its institutions fail to recognize the weaponization of economic anxiety, the effectiveness of the big lie, and the quiet erosion of legal protections.
This raises an important question, actually. The most disturbing revelation of the source text isn't that a deeply resentful man desired absolute power.
No.
It is the uncomfortable reality that he did not seize it alone. Millions of educated, modern citizens actively participated in the illusion, voting away their own democracy and acclimatizing to the legal dehumanization of their neighbors.
And that brings the text's final challenge directly to you. We've spent this deep dive mapping out the architecture of ruin, how a society can be systematically dismantled from the inside out. We've looked at the manipulation of the microphone, the manufacture of scapegoats, and the vulnerability of democratic institutions. Take a hard, analytical look at the political and informational ecosystems surrounding you right now.
Really look at them.
Based on the specific mechanisms of manipulation and the dismantling of truth we just explored, what do you think is the most glaring warning sign we should be looking for today to ensure history's darkest blueprint remains a relic of the past?